All right, well, today we are, should I wait for Rachel? Because I know she wants to know what happened on this date. I know she wants to know what happened on this date. Well, first of all, it was on this date, December 17th, that Pope Paul II excommunicated, I'm going to act like there's somebody over here, excommunicated Henry VIII. This is part of the English Reformation. It didn't really bother Henry VIII at that point because Henry VIII had already absconded with all of the church land and money and forces, so he's like, eh. And he had his next wife. So, but it was on this day that the English Reformation was official in that Henry VIII was no longer a member of the Catholic Church, which is interesting because the Pope, I don't know if it was Pope Paul II, had earlier given Henry the title of Defender of the Faith, that he was a defender of the faith, because Henry VIII had written things against the Protestant Reformation, which is odd not having anybody over here. But then, within like a decade, he's being excommunicated. So take that for what it's worth. It was on this date in 1903 that the Wright brothers did their first flight in Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. So that, and I think even on that first flight, the luggage was lost. So I'm just saying that was it. In 1989, a bellwether day for people like me, it was on this date in 1989 that The Simpsons premiered. And they're still going. 24 years? No, 34 years later, something like that. So yeah, I just remember when The Simpsons premiered, shortly after The Simpsons had premiered, they were like the #1 show. And I remember making a point in like one of the first Sunday school classes I ever made. I was going to make about, whether The Simpsons were, that we were more enamored with whether The Simpsons are going to beat The Cosby Show. This was 1989, okay? I just remember, I don't know why I remember that. I remember weird things, as you may have noticed. Speaking of weird things that I remember, it was on this date in 2003 that George Ryan, one of the Illinois' finest, a.k.a. governors, was convicted and sent to prison. He's also one of the 3 governors that I have met. So I have met 3 Illinois governors, Otto Kerner, Dan Walker, and George Ryan. So, and if you know anything about Illinois history, what do those 3 governors all have in common?
Jail.
They all went to jail.
Maybe you should meet Pritzker.
Well, I have to meet Blago first, because that will complete the Grand Slam. But yeah, I mean, I was like, when I say I met Otto Kerner, I was like riding on my dad's shoulders at the fair, and I shook his hand. My parents tell me, kind of thing. So, but that was it. And today is not a lot today, but today is Pope Francis's birthday. He was born on this date in 1936, so he's 80, whatever that is, 84, 86, something like that. Today is Pope Francis's birthday, so happy birthday to the Pope. I wonder what they do. I mean, do they have like a cake in the Vatican or something like that? What do you get the Pope for his birthday? I don't know. That's
Like a little devil to pop out of it.
that would be, yeah. Yeah, all kinds of interesting ideas of what we could do. All right, we are in 1 Corinthians 10 today. 1 Corinthians 10, and if you've already looked at the title, what are we talking about? Meat offered to idols. And I know what you're thinking. Again? Or still? Yeah, still. We are still talking about meat offered to idols. It's interesting because I was talking to Debbie on the way up, rehearsing all the jokes. She says, no, that's not, no. This is how the conversation goes. What about this? No. What about that? No. One of the, I don't know, how many of you realized before, especially those of you who've been in here before, that Paul takes up 3 chapters of 1 Corinthians to deal with meat offered to idols. I mean, most, and myself included, I'm in this group as well. To me, the meat offered to idol was one paragraph in one, and you just kind of, every passage, but when you start getting into it, you start looking at the book as a whole, you realize, wait a minute, Paul is giving a very long answer to this particular scenario, what's going on. And I never really realized it because, again, like many of us, you fall into the verse application approach to Bible study and Bible reading. That you read a verse, you say, okay, how can I apply that? And if I can come up with some way to apply that to my life, then that's what I do, and I move on. Refill my coffee and move on to whatever else I want to do in the day. But then you start looking at it and you think, oh, wait a minute, no, this applies to that and that applies to this, and it all is one big 3-chapter argument about meat offered to idols. So let's do a quick review on that. And chapter 8 was where we introduced the problem, and the problem was that meat, and this is the first line there, meat, having previously been offered to idols, is served, and notice how I edited it out. I made a mistake there. So I went through and I crossed out the word not, because that shouldn't be there. So chapter 8, meat having previously been offered to idols is served at a pagan meal, and Corinthian believers want approval to attend. So again, in Corinth, at this pagan, we talked about this, that part of the pagan practices is apparently that this meat is being offered, and then after the offering to the god, it is brought down, and within the church, it is served to the people that want to attend. Okay? And Corinthian believers, having gotten used to having a good meal every Sunday, or whatever day of the week it was, were continuing to go to this cultic meal. And I prefer that idea because later on in the passage, remember it says, if somebody sees you in the temple eating this meat. Okay, so it isn't simply a question of marketplace meat, which we're going to talk about a little bit today, where it isn't just meat purchased or leftover that's sold at market. It's being part of a process. And I think as we get into chapter 10 today, you'll see how it kind of fills in. Paul says, absolutely not, lest it destroy a weaker brother or sister. Okay. Lest it destroy a weaker brother or sister. And that's a key element there. The King James translated that verse, that word offend, where we talk about destroy. And so for a long period of time, especially when I was growing up, it was, if it offends somebody to do that, and offending somebody and destroying somebody are two different things. Paul isn't necessarily worried about somebody's sensitivity, and he isn't necessarily worried about the stronger brother either. So it's like, I can't do this because the pastor will be offended. Okay, well, kind of by definition, the pastor is a stronger brother. It's like, I'm not saying go out there and offend your pastor. Don't do that, okay? That's not a good idea. But, it isn't that the stronger brother gets to dictate what everyone else does. So again, there's an element of Christian freedom and that we have, and Paul gets into that a little bit later. But lest it destroy a weaker brother. We gave the example of a person, Debbie, wearing a burqa to church. A flowered burqa, a Christmas burqa. How about that? Would be great. That would be even better. A Christmas burqa here, with trees and Santas and all of that on it. And then that's the day that a newly converted formerly Islamic person comes in and sees Debbie in a Christmas burqa. How are they going to feel at that moment? A new believer. But in chapter 9, so after that, Paul says no. And this is all a result of responding to this letter that they had said. And Paul says, absolutely not, lest it destroy. Now in chapter 9, Paul talks about his financial support. Remember we talked in the book of Acts, when Paul goes to Corinth, he doesn't take their support. He works as a tent maker. But as soon as the church people come from, Silas and Timothy come from Macedonia with an offering, Paul gives up the tent making and goes full time. So he doesn't have a problem with taking support, to minister. He clearly doesn't want to take the Corinthian support, and this bothers some of them. And he points out that I had the right to it, I could have, but thinking it might destroy a weaker brother, he doesn't do it. So he gives this example of an opportunity of here he had the right to do something, he does not do it. Okay? Just like he's telling them, yes, you have technically the right to eat that meat, to go to that, but you shouldn't do it anyway. Okay? And now he says, here's an example. I had the right, but I didn't do it. Okay? So Paul closes that particular argument. So that was a chapter 9 review. Paul reminds the church that although he had the right to their financial support, he chose not to accept it. And Paul closes that part of the argument pointing out how he became all things to all persons, that by all possible means he might see some saved. So Paul was always thinking strategically. Okay? And I want to pick up here at the end of chapter 9 with that famous passage that we probably have all heard messages about. Do you not know, and I ended here and I want to kind of build on it a little bit. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one gets the prize? Run in such a way as to get the prize. Everyone who competes in the games goes into strict training. They do it to get a crown that will not last, but we do it to get a crown that will last forever. Therefore, I do not run like someone running aimlessly. I do not fight like a boxer beating the air. No, I strike a blow to my body and make it my slave, so that after I have preached to others, I myself will not be disqualified for the prize. Okay? So, a well-known passage. We've all heard probably sermons preached about this. But one of the things that I wanted to point out, and I didn't point it out last week. So here, where am I here? So it says the, and then in parentheses there, this is a side note. In parentheses, the word is arbitrary. Okay? Arbitrary. Because again, I reiterate the fact that the chapters and verse divisions are not original. Okay? They are arbitrary. Somebody looked at this in the 15th century and said, that's where the chapter should end. Okay, 1,500 years after it was written, somebody said, that's where the chapter should end. And then somebody 1,100 years said, that's where the chapter should end. And then 1,500 years later, in the 1500s, somebody said, this is where the verses should end. Okay, so again, there is nothing inspired about the chapter. Okay, so again, yeah, it's very convenient, and we all like chapters and verses. It makes things very easy to find, kind of stuff. But they are arbitrary. Okay, so and very often there's some passages where we've like completely missed. There's like one story in the Gospels where the chapter just really defeats the whole purpose of the text, because we tend to end, and I do too. But I'm just pointing out. Side note. Arbitrary. So the arbitrary chapter closes with Paul's famous encouragement to run the race in such a way as to gain the prize. Okay? And the point I want to make here is this is not a call for endurance. Okay? So you cannot take this passage and say, well, Paul is telling us just keep on keeping on. Right? You've ever heard that as in a sermon? Oh, yeah, Paul tells us to keep on keeping on. Not in this passage. He's not talking about endurance. He's talking about strategy. Okay, you think about what he says here. Run in such a way to get the prize. So figure out how to run in such a way. It isn't just keep running. And this reminds me of when I was in college. I had to my glorious school that I went to required students to take PE. Even then, I'm like, why? Why am I taking PE in college? But we had to take PE. And so we had to take 4 classes of PE. And one of the classes I took, and what's interesting is that of these classes I took, I have very particular lessons, life lessons I learned from each of these. So it's a good thing. And I'm going to share one of them with you now. I took a class on softball. This is how seriously I took it. I mean, I had played Little League baseball and had been a baseball fan my entire life, and had played junior high baseball. I played high school baseball. So when I get to college, what gym class do I take? Softball. Okay. But the coach of the teacher coach, one of the things he was talking about in terms of looking at games and things like that was he reiterated over and over and over again that when it comes to strategy in a game, you always change a losing game. Okay? You always change a losing game. That's just the basic fundamental point of strategy. If you're losing for a reason, change. Okay? It isn't just continue to do what you're doing. You always change a losing game. And here, again, this Paul is looking for strategy. So if you think about it, Paul says he becomes all things to all men, or all persons. Again, my King James is slipping in. All things to all men. So he's like, when he meets somebody or he's in a new situation, he thinks, okay, how do I need to act? How do I need to relate in this situation in order to bring these people to Christ? Okay, I'm not going to just burst in and do the same thing I did over there. I'm going to figure out, what do I need to do here? Paul thought strategically. He's running in a way to obtain the prize. Okay, so you change the losing game. Okay, but that's things I learned from softball. Maybe someday I'll tell you about the things I learned from taking tennis. Not how to play the game, but just kind of things like that. So it's not a call for endurance, but a call for strategy. Okay. Now, beginning here at the end of chapter 9 and going into verse 10, or chapter 10, arbitrary, chapter 10, it says, "For I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud and that they all passed through the sea." Now, the word "for" there suggests, the word "for" indicates that the next passage is a continuation of the previous thought. So here we're still talking about meat offered to idols. We're still talking about this concept. Okay, it didn't end in chapter 8. So we're in our third chapter. The Corinthians wrote this letter, and I'm guessing it's been an ongoing thing back and forth. We talked about that this is not the first communication. What we call 1 Corinthians is not the first communication with the church of Corinth. Maybe one. It's not their first conversation. Okay, and so I suspect that this is, and it's speculation because we don't have any of the letters from the Church of Corinth, that it is an ongoing thing. People are complaining about it, and Paul. This is one of the reasons why Paul's like, look, I gotta get you guys to stop this. Okay, stop doing this. But so chapter 10 is now going to give an example of people who failed to exercise the self-control or failed to take their rights into account in terms of reaching other people. So Paul's example, his personal example, is of somebody who exercised self-control, and the fact that the church exists is proof that he did the right thing. Okay, to him, it's proof that it's a success, that it was a good idea. And now Paul is going to give some Old Testament examples to say, look, here's some examples of people who had rights to do things, indulged in them, bad ending. Okay? So he says, "For I do not want you to be ignorant of the fact, brothers and sisters, that our ancestors were all under the cloud, and they all passed through the sea. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. They all ate the same spiritual food and drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ." Okay? Now, before I get into the next phrase, first of all, Paul is using use of the Old Testament here. He's talking about, and he's going to go in and talk about some Old Testament examples, illustrates the importance of the Old Testament to the New Testament church. Okay, and this is kind of important even today, because there's a movement. There's a very well-known pastor, leader, writer in evangelicalism today that caused a splash a year or so ago with a series of sermons and a book where talking about the church needed to disentangle from the Old Testament. I think that was the word he used. Disentangle from the Old Testament. We need to stop paying attention to the Old Testament. And that caused a huge row. But here, see, because Paul is not writing to Jews. He's writing to essentially a Gentile. There's a Jewish component, but it's a mixed church. So there's a lot of Gentiles in this church that are reading this letter that are thinking, wait a minute, Abraham is not my father. But Paul is saying spiritually, we're all the same, we're in the same boat kind of thing. Okay? And then he goes on to point out, and this is kind of a tricky passage, and the easiest way to describe it is that Old Testament followers of God had similar, and we'll call them entry experiences. into their faith. So the New Testament believers, they know their part of their understanding of being in the faith is their acceptance, their indwelling of the Spirit, and Paul's going to get into that a little bit later in chapter 11. But their baptism, their participation in the Lord's Supper, at the Lord's table. And Paul is saying, listen, our ancestors, speaking of the Old Testament believers, had similar experiences, okay, just in a very, very broad way. Okay, so don't overthink this. Paul is just kind of bringing these two together to say, this is why you need to listen to these Old Testament believers, because they're people of faith as well. And in fact, it's through the water, okay, again, we're talking, and again, we don't know exactly. Through the water, generally, most people believe is talking about going through the Red Sea, when they left Egypt and came through the Red Sea, okay, or through the Jordan River. Okay, that's kind of the generally accepted. What Paul is referring to here is roughly similar to New Testament baptism. Okay, the baptism of the Spirit baptism that these believers have, that the disciples were told, as you're going, baptizing them, preach the gospel, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, etc., in the Great Commission. Okay, and the same spiritual food, okay, is roughly similar to the Lord's table. Again, Paul is going to get into that in chapter 11, some things that are going wrong with it in chapter 11 with the Lord's table. It could also, just kind of as a side note, it could also be talking about the same training, education, growth, that the concepts that you're taking in, because Paul later talks about, what you're learning, I should have been giving you meat, but you're drinking milk, kind of. So sometimes he's talking about his education or his teaching, but this is similar there. But he points out that in following God in the Old Testament, they were in fact following Christ. Okay. So they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them, and that rock was Christ. Okay, now there's been long discussions about what was this spiritual rock that accompanied them. Did they, Moses strike the rock? Did they take a piece of the rock along? We don't know. Okay. Again, Paul is, using that there may have been Jewish believers that would have known exactly what he was talking about, but God provided water from the rock on at least 2 occasions in the Old Testament to the Jewish believers. Once where Moses spoke to it, once where he was told to speak to it and he hit the rock. You remember that thing, okay? But that rock was Christ. So he's pointing out these Old Testament believers are followers of Christ, just like you're a follower of Christ. Okay, they may not have known it at the time, but looking back, he said, to him, it's as clear as day. These guys are followers of Christ, just like you're followers of Christ. Okay. So nevertheless, they had all the advantages you had. They had all of the benefits of being a believer that you have. Nevertheless, God was not pleased with most of them. Their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Okay, so if you remember in the Old Testament, there was a large number of Jews got up to the border of the Promised Land, and they sent 2 spies in, and they sent 12 spies in, and 10 of the spies came back and said, no, they're too big, we can't do this, we need to, and 2 spies said, yes, we can, let's do this. Caleb and Joshua come back and say, no, yeah, we can do this. Okay, one of the things about they did a vote. They took a vote, I guess, or Moses looked at it and said, well, okay, we won't go in then, and God wasn't pleased with that. And one of the little side stories is, there was a group among them that thought, oh wait, no, we're going to do it anyway. This is part. I think it's in the Pentateuch. I don't think it's in Joshua, but there's a group that said, no, we're going to go in anyway. And do you remember that story? It didn't end well for them. They just thought they would take the thing, even though God had said, all right, fine, you're not going to take it. Oh, we can do this anyway. And it didn't end well for them. But what happened to all of the people that were part of that generation? Every single one of them, except for 2, died. So why did they have to wander in the wilderness for 40 years? Well, that's how long it took the generation to die off. Now the kids were still alive. So it's, so there, whoever was not considered an adult, so there were probably a lot of kids that remembered the moment, maybe not specifically, but they remember, oh yeah, we've been here before. Of course, now they're 52 years old, but keep in mind, Moses was 80 when he started, so, which is reassuring to those of us who actually can see 80 on the horizon. Okay, wait, 80s. And I know there are some here who look back and say, yeah, I remember 80, it was a great year, kind of thing. I was wild and crazy in my younger days, sort of thing. But be that as it may. But despite these advantages, they failed, and many, most, almost all, but 2 died. Joshua and Caleb were the only 2 that were allowed. Not even Moses. I mean, Moses didn't go in because of the whole hitting the rock thing, but didn't go into the promised land. Okay? And so Paul uses these as examples. He calls these things examples for us. And then in verse, where am I? Paul uses these as examples in verse 6 and warnings in verse 11 for the church. Okay? So we can go back and we can look at these things and we can say these are examples for us. These are warnings. This is what they did, and they didn't follow what God had specifically told them to do, and they ended up dying. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that if God tells you to do something today and you don't do it, that 5 minutes later you're going to drop dead. You might. You might drop dead anyway, but it's not. It's just you can look and say, okay, these are an example of what happens. Okay, that does not give us the license to go back to the Old Testament and make everything and do what's called spiritualizing the text. Okay, there's a lot of things that happen in the Old Testament that when the New Testament writers were writing and needing examples, they looked back and said, oh, this is what happened. Okay, just like if I want to give an example and say, you know what, if you're going to, don't, think strategically, think, change up, just like the Wright brothers did. The Wright brothers test after test after test after test. Okay, I'm just looking back to the Wright brothers and saying this is an example for us. Okay, it wasn't that the Wright brothers were there and God had said, listen, I'm going to have them fail the first dozen or so times so that on December 17th, 2023, there's a group that we can, So, and I just say that because we have a tendency to look at the Old Testament, go to the Old Testament and say, okay, well, here's a lesson, and God put this. The best example I had was I heard a sermon once about a guy talking about Abraham's servant getting a wife for Isaac, and his argument was that the process that he went through to get the wife for Isaac, and he broke it down into a perfect 3-point alliterated outline. But that the process he went through was God's pattern of how you find God's will in your life. And so this is what you have to do. And I remember talking to a guy I know, a Bible scholar, and he's like, oh, no. This is just a story. That's an example. You can use that as an example, but that is not, that if you don't follow that, you're not going to find God's will for your life kind of thing. It's like, no, it's an example. And that's really what they are. Okay, so again, he uses these as examples. He says, first of all, don't be idolaters. And he goes back, he refers to Exodus, this is from Exodus 7:26. Let me read the passage. Now these things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. Do not be idolaters as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. Now this is interesting. He's referring back, this is from Exodus 7. This is the part with the golden calf. You remember the golden calf, Moses, they get to Mount Sinai. Moses goes up the mountain, and he's gone for an inordinate amount of time in the mind of the Jewish, the Israelites. And so they go to Aaron and they say, listen, Moses isn't coming back. You need to make us a god. And so Aaron, in one of the great statements, I mean, one of my favorite statements in all of Exodus, later on, it says, so Moses, he gets all of the gold that they got, and he creates this golden calf, and they're worshiping it. And when Moses comes back down, and he says, Aaron, what are you doing? And Aaron's reply, and again, I love this. This is like my favorite. It's like, I threw the gold into the fire, and out came this calf. I'm not making this up. I mean, this is one of my favorite. It's like the kid standing in the middle of a disaster in his bedroom. What happened here? Nothing. Yeah, I threw it. Seriously, I threw it in there, and out it came. Look it up, Exodus chapter 7. But in the course of this whole process of what they're doing in Exodus 7, now to the Jewish readers, they would have understood this story clearly, and maybe they had filled it in for the Gentile believers, okay? In the course of this whole process of what they're doing in Exodus 7, they take a vote, all in favor of Moses being dead, say aye, aye. This is the Stand version, okay? It's in the Hebrew there somewhere. And they say, okay, well, let's make this calf. And one of the things they do is they have a big meal. And that's the part that Paul is quoting here, that he's calling attention to. The part about their sitting down and eating. Okay? What's Paul talking about? Meat offered to idols. Okay? So again, here they had the right, they chose not to do it, and what happened to all of them? If you remember, is this the one where 24,000 died? But a large number, they had to drink the water. I think it was the Korah was where the earth opened up. Have to remember my Old Testament apostasy scenes better. There will be a quiz on this, by the way, for those of you new here. He says, do not be idolaters as some of them were. As it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and got up to indulge in revelry. We should not commit sexual immorality as some of them did. Okay, again, remember we talked about this in chapter 5, where Paul is condemning them for the man who's living with his father's wife. So he's already talked, as some of them did. And in one day, 23,000 of them died. Okay. Where am I here? We should not commit sexual immorality. We should not test Christ as some of them did and were killed by snakes. And do not grumble as some of them did and were killed by the destroying angel. Now, some of these we have, like, don't test Christ as some of them did, probably goes back to Numbers 21. Don't commit sexual immorality. There's all kinds of examples in the Old Testament of that. And don't grumble. And I think that last thing is because he knows that this blanket, you can't be a part of this, these cultic meals isn't going to go over well. Can't believe him. Paul won't let us have any fun. Have to eat second-rate food, kind of. He says, don't grumble like them. So he's giving these examples. And then his point here is to the church at Corinth is that the church is closer to failing than they think. Okay? So after he says all these other things, these Old Testament examples of meat offered to idols, and he says, and again, we quote this verse all the time, these things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the culmination of the age has come. So if you think you are standing firm, be careful that you don't fall. Okay, now, how many of you, be careful, he thinks you stand lest you fall. I can't remember how it goes in the King James. How many of you have heard that verse in the context of this whole Old Testament story? So Paul is telling the church, this church at Corinth, that thinks they are right on top of things, that think they have the freedom to do anything, and Paul is saying, you are much closer to falling than you think you are. Okay? That's the point Paul is making when he talks about that, beware of him that thinketh he stand, take heed lest he fall. I think that's how the King James do it, right? And we use that in, again, generally it's a pretty obvious verse, but I think it's just interesting when you think about it in the whole context of his argument. Guys, you are, this close, okay, to falling, okay? And I think in Paul's opinion, I think these guys have just ruined whatever testimony, have destroyed whatever testimony they have, that they're destroying weaker brothers, they're doing all of this. you know. And of course, if you read that, you think, man, seriously, Paul, you can't seriously think that we can do all of this. You don't seriously think, Paul, that we can follow all of your instructions here. You don't seriously think that this is going to fly. Well, actually, Paul does, because his next verse is, no temptation has taken you except what is common to mankind. And God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond you can bear. But when you are tempted, he will also provide a way out so that you can endure it. So Paul is in that, beware, has anybody heard of passage, that verse quoted? Okay, there has no temptation taking you, but such as is common. I was telling Debbie when I was in high school, I went to a Christian high school, Baptist high school. Excuse me, it's a Baptist high school, because it was a Christian high school. Then they changed their name to a Baptist high school. So given a choice between being Christian and being Baptist, Baptist won, which is still my thing. Do I want to be a Christian? Do I want to be a Baptist? I don't. That's free. I'll edit that part out. Okay, but. There was, at the time, this was like at the peak of the Christian day school movement. Every other church had its own Christian day school, and there was this, and it still exists. There's an organization, the Illinois Association of Christian Schools, and they would have an academic tournament every year, and so we would have these contests, and one of them was Old Testament knowledge, and one of them was New Testament knowledge that you would have, and they would give you a book to read, and you would get tested over this book. And so I went, so I would have been like a junior in high school or something like that. I know, sophomore, junior in high school, and our book was 1 Corinthians. Okay, and again, you would have to memorize. And so one of the reasons why when what is this in the King James? Because of course at that point it was all King James. So this is King James is popping up, and when you read it through like 15, 20 times, but all of that reading, all of that study. A lot of the stuff, never, that there were 3 passages, 3 chapters, no. It was just read the verse and, there hath no temptation. And again, this was one of the verses. There hath no temptation taken you, but such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above that you are able, but will with the temptation also make a way to escape that you may be able to bear it. Whew. About that, huh? Things, if I ever get to the point where I've lost all of my short-term memory, one thing I will remember is 1 Corinthians in the King James Version, kind of thing. But again, and that's a great verse, and that's a great promise to us. But that passage, what Paul is doing is he's preempting the Corinthian believers' excuse for not being able to do what he wants. Okay? It's an encouragement verse, and I'm not saying you're misusing it if you use it to just say as a thing, but it's like, just understand, this is what Paul is doing. He's preempting their excuses here. Paul warns that the church is closer to failing than they think. Paul encourages the church in verse 13 that there is a way out, that you are not going to be tempted above that you are able. Okay? So if there is a temptation, you will be able to bear it. But in verse 14, therefore, my dear friends, in light of all of this, flee from idolatry. Okay? So Paul is saying, don't hang around somewhere where you're going to be tempted. Okay? So when Paul says this, it's not like, oh, I can go anywhere I want and God will keep me from temptation. Okay? I think, because the very next verse is to say, flee from idolatry. Okay, so again, this promise that Paul is making, or this preemption Paul is making, is not saying that, okay, somebody who is consistently putting himself or herself into bad situations is suddenly going to be able to say, oh, you know what, I can put myself in this very bad situation and count on God to get me out of it. I'll be okay, because at the point of, whatever it is, I'll be able to get out of it. Paul says, no, flee. Don't put yourself in this situation. Flee from idolatry. Flee, kind of like if you've seen the Lord of the Rings. How many have seen the Lord of the Rings movie? Anyone seen that? That fly, you fools. That's what he said. Fly. Don't hang around there. Don't be in the same room. Okay? Yeah, it will provide a way to escape from temptation, but that doesn't mean you should just put yourself in the middle of it. Okay? Flee from idolatry. I speak to sensible people. You know, I used to, so many ways I could go with that. I speak to sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I see. You know, and I speak for, I think you guys know what I'm talking about, right? When he says, I speak to sensible people, you guys know this, right? Judge for yourself what I say. Because then he's going to make a long argument here, and he's going to introduce a concept that he hasn't yet. Okay? Remember we talked about the earlier on where the Corinthians argument was that an idol has no objective reality. And so I can eat meat offered to idol. It doesn't matter. It's not going to make any difference. Okay, so it's no objective reality. And then Paul says, yeah, but it does have a subjective reality in the sense that it is real to them. It is real to the people. They think it's real. And that's an important consideration. Just because it's not real to you doesn't mean it's not real to them. Okay, or let me rephrase that. Just because objectively it isn't real, they think it's real, don't play with that. Okay? Again, you know, it's kind of like we all kind of understand the concept. We think about it. Do you, as an adult, walk up to a 3-year-old at this time of year and loudly announce the, how should we put this, the lack of existence of a certain individual who apparently is known to travel on December 25th? Is that, how many of you think, oh, yeah, that's a great idea? Now, there are people who do. Okay? But we don't do that, right? Because we think, yes, there is no objective reality to anybody in a red suit and 8 tiny reindeer. Okay? We may know that there's no objective reality to that, but we know that we don't walk up to a 3-year-old that we don't know or somebody and say, by the way, do you know that's all a lie? This is how not to get invited to the family Christmas party. So if that's your goal, go for it. Okay? But, you know, we just don't do that. And Paul is like, you know, yeah, there is no objective reality to this, but don't play with that. Okay? But then he takes it a step further as far as the idea in this next passage here. Therefore, my dear friends, flee from idolatry. I speak to sensible people. Judge for yourselves what I say. Is not the cup of thanksgiving for which we give thanks a participation in the blood of Christ? So when we are partaking in a meal and giving thanks to Christ, are we not, when we are in this meal, are we not participating in the body of Christ? And these are negatively phrased in hope of a yes answer, a positive answer. And is not the bread that we break a participation in the body of Christ? Because there is one loaf, we who are many are one body, for we all share the one loaf. So when you meet together as brothers and sisters and partake of the meal, and we'll talk more about this when we get to 11 and we talk about the Lord's Supper and how that all developed. But he's pointing out here that there is a participation in the body of Christ at that point. There is something spiritual about it. There is actually an objective reality that we can't necessarily see. And he's like, consider the people of Israel. Did not those who eat the sacrifices participate in the altar? Okay, and again, this is going back to the Old Testament, and we mentioned this earlier when we talked about, you know, that they were eating in the Jewish practice. They would be eating of the meat that had been left over. Okay. Are they not participating in the altar? Do I mean then that food sacrificed to an idol is anything, or that an idol is anything? No, there's no objective reality to that. But the sacrifices of pagans are offered to demons. And this is where he brings his final point in. Okay? That this is demonic. This is of the devil. This is of the evil one. Okay? And I do not want you to be participants with demons. It's a kind of a that's like Paul's understatement of the year. Yeah, I don't want you to be a part of that. You know, you cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons too. You cannot have a part in both the Lord's table and the table of demons. Can't do it. Are we trying to arouse the Lord's jealousy? Are we stronger than he? Again, this is going, Paul just about earlier said, oh, there's no temptation, but he also said, don't be a part of it. Okay? Don't count on putting yourself in this horrendous, making all of bad decision, bad decision, bad decision, bad decision, bad decision, bad decision, and then all of a sudden, oh yeah, well, God's going to rescue me here. You may be in too far. Okay? Could God rescue you? Absolutely. There's no question. I'm not saying it. It's like, at some point, God's going to say, well, that's what he wants, It's like things, you don't put on a Mets uniform and a Mets hat and buy a ticket and go stand in front of Shea Stadium or whatever. Where do the Mets play now? I don't even know. Does anybody know? Where do the Mets play? It's whatever stadium. They used to play in Shea Stadium. Go stand in front of the Mets Shea Stadium and think that at that point, okay, God, keep me from going into this pit of iniquity, which of course, anywhere the Mets are playing is a den of iniquity. Okay, but remember I told you it's part of the church constitution now that Mets fans automatically ejected. It's in there. It's in there. You guys, those of you didn't pay attention, but it's in there. It's in there. Mets fans, out. Okay. So, regardless, the first thing is to flee from iniquity, because participating in the Lord's table is participating in the blood of Christ. Israelites participating in eating meat are part of the process. And there's my pride and joy. You see the three little dots? I had to look around and find a little, like a therefore. That's kind of a shorthand for therefore, the three little dots. Therefore, it would have been a lot easier for me to just write the word therefore, but I got it in my head that I'm going to find this thing. But therefore, eating meat offered to idols is participating with demons, and you can't have it both ways. Okay? You can't have it both ways. Okay? And later on, Paul is going to say, come out from among them and be separate. Paul's command to the church, and I'm going to develop this later in this thing, Paul's command to the Corinthian church and to the church in general is that you are to be radically different from the world. Okay? And it's easy, it was easy to do in this time period, in a pagan culture. It's very easy to do. Very easy to be radically different, okay? In the West, it's become harder because we've kind of conflated the idea with what we normally do to be the idea of what is radically different. And I would argue that we've really gone off the deep end there. But Paul is saying be radically different, and he's going to tell it come out from among them and be separate, okay? Verse 23, I have the right to do anything you say. Again, quoting from I was running out of space, so there's not a lot of things to fill in here on the page. I have the right to do anything you say, but not everything is beneficial. I have the right to do anything, but not everything is constructive. Again, Paul's reiterating what he said at the start of chapter 8. Okay? No one should seek their own good, but the good of others. Eat anything sold in the market without raising questions of conscience, for the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. Now he's talking about, Paul once again quotes from the Corinthian letter in verse 23. Paul closes with an example of eating market food. And again, remember they said there were apparently two things going on. There was food that was being sold in the market that had been offered to idols, and then there were these cultic meals. And I think Paul is more concerned with the cultic meals. Now he's talking about this marketplace food. Okay? Eat anything sold in a meat market without raising questions of conscience, for the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. If an unbeliever invites you to a meal and you want to go, eat whatever is put before you without raising questions of conscience. Okay? So if an unbeliever brings you in and happens to serve you food, this meat that's offered to idols, okay, at that point you don't have to say, oh well, I can't do this because this is meat offered to a demon. He's like, at that point, don't do it. You're not in the cultic meal. This is at somebody's home. Okay, so you're not participating in the meal. This is just leftover meat. So that's not the time to point out that this is demonic. Again, Paul think strategically. Okay. But if someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, and then do not eat it, both for the sake of the one who told you and for the sake of conscience, then do not eat it, both for the sake of conscience, For the sake of the one who told you, and then for the sake of conscience. I am referring to the other person's conscience, not yours. Okay, so again, this is what we're to be focusing on. Now, the next passage is a little weird. Okay, it's kind of tough because then it seems, for why is my freedom being judged by another's conscience? If I take part in the meal with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of something I thank God for? Now, again, looking at the text, we don't have we don't have the punctuation that we have nowadays. But I think here, this is a Pauline aside. Paul is like, why are you guys picking on me for what I'm eating? Okay, does that, again, if we were writing this in contemporary English, it would be, if he was making the same arguments, why are you guys getting on my case about this? Okay, you're the ones that are in trouble here. Okay, Paul's final thought, if I take part in the meal with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of something I thank God for? Again, why are you picking on me? I'm eating this meat offered to, apparently Paul is eating this meat at unbelievers' house, and now they're picking on him about it. And he's like, hey, I'm thanking God for it, and I'm trying to reach these people, and you guys are still focused on this. So whether you eat, now this is finally going to end this whole meat offered to idol thing. 3 chapters later, we're going to finally end this. So whatever you eat or drink, or whatever you do, now do it all for the glory of God. How many of you, whatsoever therefore you do, whether eat or drink, do all the glory of God? Okay. How many of you, when you've heard that passage, really understood that is the grand summation of Paul's argument about meat offered to idols? Most of us don't. We just think, oh, it's a command to do all to the glory of God. And it is. It is. Okay? But Paul is talking, we look at it nowadays and we look at our verse application approach to the Bible. It's atomization where we just one verse, and that's it. We think, oh, that's talking about bringing glory to God. No, it's the conclusion of the eating and drinking is the main point that Paul is making. So whether therefore you eat or drink or whatever you do, do it all for the glory of God. Do not cause anyone to stumble. Do not destroy anyone. Okay? Whether Jews, Greeks, or the church of God, even as I try to please everyone in every way, for I am not seeking my own good, but the good of many, so that they may be saved. Why do you do this? So that by all possible means, some might be saved. Paul's thinking straight. So even in going back to, should you eat meat offered to idol? Should you do this? Is this going to, without destroying my own personal conscience, is it going to bring people to Christ? That's Paul's thing. That's his thing. That's what he's out there. Follow my example. Do what I do. Okay? Unlike my parenting technique, do as I say, not as I do. Okay? It's not a good technique, I'm just saying. Paul's saying, do what I do. And that's kind of interesting. I mean, how many of us could say that? Really seriously get up in front of a group and say, listen, you need to just do what I do. Most of us is like, really? Seriously? Oh, I don't know. Yeah, you should do as I do, except for that thing and that other thing. And that neither, no. Yeah, forget about that. No. Just do as I say. Okay, kind of thing. Wait, there's that one thing I do well. Follow that. Everything else, forget about. Okay, I mean, Paul's like, do what I do. Okay, do what I do when it comes to this. Run that you may obtain the prize. Think strategically. Don't destroy people. Any questions? Next week, next time, and next time is going to be in 3 weeks, because there's not going to be an ABF next week. There isn't going to be an ABF the week after that. So then after that is January something will be our next time. We'll get into the really fun stuff you've all been waiting for. Women wearing head coverings, spiritual gifts, women keeping silent in the churches.
Oh, yeah, fun.
So, ladies, get your statements in now. That'll be a real quiet one, I'm sure. Yes, Dave.
We need to get more women in here.
Yeah, right.
Right. Well, you need to get more men in here.
But you don't know what I'm going to say. I'm sorry, Dave, go ahead.
Just a modern day discussion in my office this week amongst Christians that I think has application out of the scripture. The question of should a Christian go to a gay wedding, especially when that gay wedding is someone's son or daughter or sister, brother. And I think this verse has application to say, for the sake of their salvation and relationship, you could go. I was just curious what your immediate reaction is.
I would go.
Yeah, this was a great teaching because it answered a lot of questions that I have in my head about even Christmas, the things with Christmas and, the quote, paganism of Christmas, which I see a lot of things, a lot of Christians shouldn't celebrate, true Christians shouldn't celebrate, partake or anything like that. But just things like that and a more everyday, worldly thing, which is gay weddings, they happen.
Mhm.
And beating somebody over the head with what we know to be true isn't going to further the kingdom of God at all. And
No.
you can partake if it furthers, but not, participate in.
Yeah. I think that with the question of the gay, going to a gay wedding, and it's an interesting question. It's a battle versus the war kind of thing. So, do you think that the straight brother of the person getting married is going to leave that wedding coming home thinking, I really want to go to that church now. The church, I really want to go to Dave's church now because he didn't come to my brother's wedding. I mean, is that going to make him say, is that going to drive a person to Christ? Or, to me, no, it's not, kind of thing. But any other question? Anything else? There's all kinds of stuff like that. Thinking Paul doesn't really address that specific Romans, more in Romans, but anything else?
I have a question.
Yes.
In a modern day interpretation of what you're speaking of, how Paul says if somebody offers you meat and they tell you that it is meat that was sacrificed, in an occultic practice or whatever in the Bible, what in a modern day interpretation, what would that mean?
I mean, what would be a cultural equivalent to that?
Yes.
Well, I think going to a gay wedding is a good example of something that, somebody is pointing out that I would never go to that. I wouldn't do that. I think Paul is I don't know, Dave, do you think better? Is there
So
a
the
better?
meat is the gay wedding?
Well, I mean, don't draw that too tightly. You're welcome. I think.
Something I said.
No. Yeah,
Kidding.
something I said. We were fine until we got to the gay wedding thing.
I'm sorry.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Dave.
Conversation, actually.
I don't know exactly. Again, I think going to, there's a lot of things that, and not here, and I don't have an experience here at First Baptist, but I've been in environments where there's a lot of policing going on. You went to a Hollywood movie. Oh, you listen to that kind of music, or you went to that, would you? Yeah, a lot of judging going on. So it could be almost anything. It could be even doing the right thing. Again, Paul is like, is this bringing people to Christ? Is this, or is this going to drive people away from Christ? And even still, there's a line. There's a certain line where you don't draw. It's like, well, if you want me to come to church, then you're going to commit adultery. Well, no, that's, there's still a line. But it's like when you know, if we accept the idea that there are gray areas, what are called, you know, gray areas, and yet, you know, in theory we accept gray areas, but in practice we tend not to. We think our decisions are black and white. It's like, oh well, I understand. This is what the Bible says, and this is what I need to do.
I don't know that it's a gray area so much as a hill not worth dying on.
Like the minutia, like the little detail maybe?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The details
I mean,
of something
you
like.
know the gay wedding is wrong,
Right.
but you know, you're not gonna gain anything for the kingdom by dying on that hill.
Right, and we're to love the sinners
Right.
and show love to them without judging. You know, God will show them. I think my participating or going is not important. It's to love, show them love.
I'll think,
How
yeah.
simple I am.
I've got to go. I've got to get it. I'll think about your question,
Yeah.
and come back in 3 weeks.
That I would, but I actually really glad that I came to this one. And my